It is 1982, and the waning stages of the Great Sabbath War are at hand. But not before the bands fire off one final salvo, in the shape of not one, but two double live albums. These double live albums are amongst my favorites, albeit both are flawed and controversial. Tonight, the controversies and the makings of Speak of the Devil. Tonight, the making of and the controversies of Live Evil. The final battles of the Great Sabbath War. Next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. Tonight, we are going to chronicle the end of one of the greatest feuds in the history of heavy metal, Black Sabbath versus Ozzy Osbourne, and the creation of two of the greatest live albums in the history of heavy metal. But before we get to that point, I think we probably need to do a quick recap of how we got to this situation. In 1970, Black Sabbath were the pioneers of heavy metal. But by 1978, creative differences were starting to creep into the band, album sales were waning, and lead guitarist Tony Iommi was wanting to take the band in a more commercial direction. And this did not set well with their lead singer, one Ozzy Osbourne. So Ozzy quit the band. Well, cooler heads prevailed. Ozzy came back. They put out a couple more albums. But by 1979, Tony Iommi decided to fire Ozzy Osbourne. You can't quit. You're fired. Obviously, this did not set well with Ozzy Osbourne. Meanwhile, on the recommendation of none other than Sharon Osbourne, Black Sabbath is introduced to their new lead singer, a man by the name of Ronnie James Dio, who had recently been fired and or quit from the legendary band Rainbow. And together they would reforge the Black Sabbath name. At the exact same time, Sharon Osbourne falls in love with Ozzy, marries him, and begins managing his solo career, where he has formed a solo band with guitar prodigy Randy Rhoads. Now, the result of all of this is that we have four of the greatest albums of all time: Heaven and Hell, Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, and Mob Rules are four of the greatest heavy metal albums that you'll ever hear. But that doesn't mean things are still smooth. Ozzy is still very upset by the fact that Black Sabbath fired him and replaced him with Ronnie James Dio. So he's hanging a dwarf in effigy at all of his shows named Ronnie, making fun, of course, Ronnie James Dio's smaller stature. Well, Ronnie James Dio isn't going to be real happy with this, these not-so-subtle jabs, so he goes out and basically calls Ozzy a stupid Neanderthal animal, end quote. Let's just say things were brewing in this feud. The war of words had long been happening. But now two events are going to happen that's going to bring these two forces back together again. The first is the fact that Black Sabbath has never officially put out a live album. Sorry, Live at Last, you do not count. The second event that's going to happen is the publishing rights to all the old Black Sabbath songs have expired. And now everybody, from the band and the management groups, everybody's seeing dollar signs floating above their heads. There is a great way for everybody to get rich off these old songs. Which leads us to now, two live albums are in the works. We are going to discuss both of these live albums, how they came to be and the controversies surrounding them, in order of their release date. So let's start with the first of the two albums, Speak of the Devil, Ozzy Osbourne. All right, let's talk about Speak of the Devil, or if you lived in England at the time, Talk of the Devil. Apparently, they don't have that phrase, Speak of the Devil, means nothing to them. Kind of one of those interesting translation issues. Anyway, so back to the whole incident. We are talking about the publishing rights of Black Sabbath have expired. So anybody wanting to put these songs out can make a lot of money. So the record company says, "Hey, Ozzy, we want you to put out a double live album with all of these old songs on them." And Ozzy also and Sharon also see a lot of money to be made here, so they agree. Now, interestingly enough, the Blizzard of Oz band, again led by Randy Rhoads and Tommy Aldridge, were not happy with this development. They had already put out 2 legendary albums and really didn't feel like going back into the old Sabbath catalog was a good move for them career-wise. And they convinced bassist Randy Sarzo to come in, so all 3 of them approached Ozzy Osbourne and said, "No, we're not interested in doing an old Black Sabbath album." Now, Ozzy got very upset at this, went into a drunken stupor, and rumor has it, might have been the drunken stupor he was on when he urinated on the Alamo. So this whole thing ties all the way back to the whole Alamo incident. Anyway, once again, Randy Rhoads and crew threatened to quit. Ozzy, in a drunken stupor, fires them all. But again, cooler heads prevail. Randy Rhoads decides to go ahead and do the double live album. But unfortunately, tragedy strikes, and Randy Rhoads is killed in a just a senseless airplane accident. So, the original plans for this double live album with Randy Rhoads playing, they were going to do, because not only were they going to make an album, they had planned on making this video. Apparently they were going to shoot it in Toronto, Canada, and it was quite the spectacle. But now with Randy Rhoads gone, all those plans got scrapped. Except, of course, that they did go ahead and go on with the live album. Now, if anybody was following the Ozzy career back in those days, you would know that not only did this whole live album cause him to get back on the into a terrible state alcohol-wise, the death of Randy Rhoads just further exacerbated that problem. Ozzy was a complete and utter mess. So the band brings in first Bernie Torme to come in and be the guitarist. That wasn't working out. So enter Brad Gillis. You may know him. He was the lead guitarist from Night Ranger, but Night Ranger hadn't even put out their first album yet, so he was a relative unknown at the time of this Speak of the Devil. So instead of doing this big lavish production in Toronto, they do a couple of shows in New York, and they do film them. So there is technically a Speak of the Devil movie out there. It was actually broadcast on MTV, I believe, for a bit. So people trying to find the tapes of this has been one of those heavy metal treasure hunts for a long time. But here's the issue. Nobody had really had a chance to rehearse. In fact, the band had not played with Ozzy at all when they decided to do these recordings. And Ozzy himself had not sang these songs in years, and in his current state really couldn't even be held responsible for remembering the lyrics. So rumor has it that as he was performing these songs, they had a kind of a chair propped up with, a little notebook where he could read off the lyrics as he was singing them. Now, interestingly enough, the controversy about this album from a fan perspective is Brad Gillis's guitar playing. So let's get that out of the way. Brad Gillis really had really very little time to rehearse the Black Sabbath songs, and so he plays them in a way differently than what Tony Iommi would play. But I think that story is a little bit overblown, in that if you listen to some of the Sabbath material Randy Rhoads produced that was later included in the Double Live album Tribute, you'll also notice Randy Rhoads didn't play him to the original Tony Iommi specs either. I think the piece that people are missing is Ozzy Osbourne was not Black Sabbath. Ozzy Osbourne was a much more modern version of Black Sabbath. And so Ozzy and the band really didn't play that slow, doomy, grungy type of sludgy material. They were always going to be a little bit more upbeat. And of course, Randy Rhoads was one of the great guitar composers of all time. He was just going to go wild on these songs. So Brad Gillis took his cues from Randy Rhoads and just shreds on these songs. Like, they'll play it pretty much to the, maybe a little bit faster, but they keep to it. And then all of a sudden, Brad Gillis just goes into these tremendous shredding, just goes off. Now, some people were turned off by that because I remember one person saying it's like Black Sabbath met Van Halen. It wasn't. So Sabbath purists have never looked at this album very favorably. I, on the other hand, kind of like the newer, updated versions of these Sabbath songs. And I actually think some of the songs on this double live album are some of the definitive versions of the Sabbath. And if we're putting all of our cards on the table, when I heard Speak of the Devil for the first time, it was kind of the first time I'd heard many of these Sabbath songs. Sabbath had been something that when I came into it, Ozzy had already left. Dio was already the lead singer of Sabbath, so I kind of heard a lot of these Sabbath songs for the first time with the Brad Gillis version. So let's talk about this. There's a couple of songs in here, in particular, Snowblind, Sweet Leaf, Paranoid, War Pigs, where Brad Gillis just absolutely goes to town. And maybe makes a better version of the song than what originally existed on the albums. So while many people were turned off by Brad Gillis and made this their point of controversy, I actually think it's a strength. Brad Gillis, again, goes on to be the lead guitarist of Night Ranger, but holy cow, I always felt like his talents were kind of wasted in that band. If you want to hear great guitar work, if you want to hear what Brad Gillis is capable of, go back to Speak of the Devil and just be in awe of Brad Gillis's playing. The other thing I'll say about, and I think these are some of the highlights of Speak of the Devil, is the crowd and Ozzy's interaction with the crowd are fantastic. Right off the bat, when the album kicks off, you have the crowd chanting, Ozzy, Ozzy. It's a packed house. They are stoked to see Ozzy. And I always feel like that is the measure of a good live album, is that crowd interaction. This isn't a studio album, folks. We're not sitting here trying to recreate a studio album in a live setting. We're trying to bring in the crowd. And this album, the production of it is fantastic. I also want to say that Tommy Aldridge, I could sit here and talk about Brad Gillis all day, but Tommy Aldridge's drumming on this album is sensational. Kind of funny when you learn that Tommy Aldridge didn't even want to do these songs. Then you see him do them spectacularly. Brad Gillis gets all the heat and gets all the credit, depending on what side of the fence you fall on. But go back and listen to Tommy Aldridge's drumming. It is sensational. And Rudy Sarzo does a very good job on the bass. And again, the production really brings out that bass, unlike the one we're going to talk about here in a minute. Ozzy's, they had to touch up some of the vocals because, again, Ozzy's in a bad state. Ozzy was never had the greatest voice to begin with. So rumor has it they had to redo some of the vocals back in the studio. But, with every live album, you have a little bit of that touching up going on, so I don't hold that against it. So overall, I would say that Speak of the Devil is an absolute beast of a double live album. And if you were like me back in the early 80s and were not familiar with all of the old Sabbath tunes, man, I loved this album. So much so I went back and started picking up the old Sabbath songs, and you can't top, right, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward. You can't top that. But boy, Ozzy and Brad Gillis sure gave it their all. So overall, the first of these two albums, big thumbs up for Speak of the Devil. Live Evil has two major controversies. The first, let's just get it out of the way right now. Ronnie James Dio singing signature Ozzy Osbourne songs was always going to rile up certain fans. If you were a fan of Ozzy, having Dio sing those Ozzy songs was probably a little bit jarring. But let me just say once again, very similar to Brad Gillis's playing of Tony Iommi songs, I actually love many of the songs that Dio sings and believe that a couple of them may be the definitive versions of those songs. So let's talk about the songs Dio sang that were original Ozzy Osbourne songs. The first song that they play is N.I.B. And quite frankly, if I want to listen to N.I.B., I go to this album. The Dio version, to me, is the definitive one. So we're off to a good start. The second Black Sabbath song that Dio sings is the original, Black Sabbath. Once again, if I want to hear the song Black Sabbath, I go to this live album. I believe it is the definitive version of that as well. 2 for 2 for Mr. Dio. The third song, War Pigs, while it may not be the definitive version, it is a very good version of it, and Dio alters the way this thing is sung for eternity because he's the one who adds the vocal chorus at the back end of it that now even Ozzy does when he plays the song. So whether you think it's the definitive version or not, he changed the way Black Sabbath performed this for the next 40 years. I would say Dio doing Ozzy numbers, 3 for 3. But then things start to turn south just a tad, because the next song is Iron Man. And it's really hard for Dio to do Iron Man because, let's face it, this is like the signature moment of Ozzy's career where he belts out, "I am Iron Man." Over the years, I really felt that maybe Dio should have had the crowd sing the "I Am Iron Man" beginning, very similar to like a sing-along that they did with Heaven and Hell. So, you'd hear that iconic Tony Iommi riff, and then the crowd would yell out, "I am Iron Man," and then Dio could break into the song, and I think it would have been a little bit better received. Ironically, on Speak of the Devil, Ozzy does just that, where they play that opening guitar riff and let the crowd sing "I Am Iron Man." So kind of a, maybe it would have gone a little bit better way for Dio if he had not tried to sing that iconic opening moment, because a lot of people really didn't care for that piece of it. Although, again, I didn't feel like it was, it didn't really matter to me. He's the new lead singer of the band, whatever the case may be, but that was very controversial. Nonetheless, I would say that Dio's 4 for 4, but, maybe could have done that one a little bit different and avoided some of that controversy. Now, the next Sabbath song they play is Paranoid. And even here, I'm going to side with the Ozzy fans. Dio singing Paranoid just doesn't fit. It's not Dio's personality. It's not the personality of Sabbath, who's gone to a much darker place. I think they would have been much better off doing one of their songs. Die Young should have been on this album. Falling Off the Edge of the World could be on this album. I think Paranoid they probably should have just left off. It's nitpicky stuff, but at the end of the day, this again is a very signature Ozzy song and not really fit Dio's singing style or personality. And finally, they end the last Sabbath song they do, Children of the Grave. Surprisingly, I really thought Dio would do a stronger performance on this one, and while he does fine on it, doesn't quite work. I'm not sure why. So I would say at the end of the day, Dio 4, Ozzy 2. But again, I get why Sabbath put so many of these old songs on there. Again, we're talking money reasons, and also the fact that Black Sabbath had never had a live album, so they wanted to show off their new lead singer. But I think I would have preferred a few less old Black Sabbath and a fewer newer tracks. There was always going to be, although so we thought, going to be future opportunities to maybe play some of these other songs live or in different ways. But I always felt like maybe playing one of the darker, like Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, or Symptom of the Universe, or some of those would have fit Dio better than, say, Paranoid, but nonetheless. And as for the songs that Dio sang from his era, fantastic renditions of Children of the Sea, the definitive version of Voodoo. If you like Voodoo on Mob Rules, there's like some vocal ad-libs at the end of it. I love, if I'm going to listen to Voodoo, I go right here to Live Evil. I love the Heaven and Hell, the definitive version of that song is on Live Evil. The only thing I do nitpick a little bit, Dio loved to do those medleys where you start off with one song. So he starts off with Sign of the Southern Cross, and then they break into, they don't finish Sign of the Southern Cross. They go back into Heaven and Hell and all the things that go on there. So Heaven and Hell starts on one side, and of course, I'm listening to this in an album. So Heaven and Hell starts on one side of an album. You have to go to a whole different side of an album to get to finishing. That was a little bit weak sauce for me, but again, the definitive version of one of the greatest songs of all time with Heaven and Hell. So overall, Dio doing the material he did with Sabbath, he knocked it out of the park every single time. I'd have liked to have seen them play again like Die Young. Would have been a good one. Falling Off the Edge would have been good. I would have liked to have seen them do Sign of the Southern Cross in its entirety, maybe put Heaven and Hell together, but all in all, really, really good stuff. But that portends to the other controversy of this album, and probably the one that's more widely known. The production issues on this album are horrific. Listen, it's a live album. I get it. You're going to have certain things you have to live with in the production, but this goes beyond just your usual, this is a live album, and you have some production issues. Interestingly enough, Iron Maiden might be partly responsible for this, because if you go back to Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, Martin Birch was the producer and one of the best producers in the history of heavy metal. Dio had worked with him in Rainbow, so long-standing person who really knew how to bring out the best in Dio and Sabbath. Well, he's busy putting together, probably at this point, Number of the Beast for Iron Maiden. So he's busy and can't do the production for Live Evil. And it seems like Tony Iommi probably had a little bit too much coke in his system and was a little bit too happy with the dials and really screwed up the production. And this isn't the only example of this. In just a year or so, he's going to put out their next album, Born Again, which also has major production issues. So Tony Iommi, one of the greatest guitarists of all time, should never be allowed to mix an album, ever. And if you listen to the production on the stuff they did with Heaven and Hell many years later, if they could have had that kind of production when the band was at their peak, I think this had the possibility of being one of the greatest live albums of all time. As it was, a really good album, one of my all-time favorites. It's kind of like, an ugly dog, you still love them to death. I love this album, but I understand the flaws. I understand why people have some issues with it. Not only was the production bad, the guitars just sounded so muddy and so unclear. One of the things I loved about the Dio era of Black Sabbath was the great guitaring of Tony Iommi, the great bass player of Geezer Butler, and it just isn't represented on this album very well. The guitars are very muddy. The bass and the drums at times are almost non-existent. And the crowd noise. The crowd sounds like they're in a stadium across the street from Sabbath in an arena. Like, they're there, they're there, but you can barely hear them. There's times even when Dio's interacting with the crowd, sing Heaven and Hell, you can barely hear them. I want you to roll a big one. Heaven and Hell. When you look at the two albums side by side, the fact that Ozzy's has such a loud, boisterous crowd noise, Sabbath is very sterile, really hurts, I think, overall album. As a matter of fact, the production on this album was so bad that in some ways it led to the breakup of Black Sabbath. You talk about a heartbreaking moment for this young metalhead when I learned that Black Sabbath had broken up and Vinny Appice and Dio had gone off to do their own thing. Rumor has it, right, that Dio and Vinny went into the studio to start doing the mixing of this album. No Tony Iommi, no Geezer Butler. Again, both of those gentlemen having lots of problems at the time with cocaine. Days would go by. No Tony, no Geezer. And so the rumor has it, Ronnie and Vinny just started messing around with the sound a little bit. So all of a sudden, Tony shows up a couple weeks later and asks, what's been going on? And the producer at the time said, oh, well, Dio and Vinny were in here messing with the thing, bringing up the vocals and the drums. Tony goes into a rage and fires Dio, and Vinny Appice leaves with him. So this production, like I said, led to the unfortunate end for Black Sabbath. Of course, Dio and Vinny Appice would resurface in the band Dio a little bit later. We also talked about the fact that Ozzy had planned to do this big video performance in Toronto, Canada. It gets scrapped after Randy Rhoads' death, so they do that special in New York. And even though it's shown on MTV, like unless you had a VCR in those days and recorded it, those videos have seemingly become lost over time, that those have gone the way of the dodo. Black Sabbath also filmed Live Evil. You can even hear Dio, as he's bantering with the crowd, say, not only is this going to be our first live album, but we're also recording this for a video as well. Those tapes have never resurfaced. And there's a lot of rumors, again, conspiracy theories about what happened to those tapes. At the time, they were quote unquote lost. Who knows? Sabotage. I always, I'll just start my own rumor because I've never heard this anywhere else. But it's like, wait a minute. At that point, Sharon Osbourne and Ozzy were competing directly with Sabbath. Sabbath was being managed by her father, Don Arden. And I don't know, maybe Sharon had, keys to the Warner Brothers studio and got in there and took care of business. I don't know. But anyway, it's just ironic that both of these albums were both supposed to be these big video productions. Neither one of them actually ever saw the light of day. Just another similarity, strange similarity between these two great albums. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma. Everybody's going back into the old Sabbath catalog to make a little moolah. You have two live albums. The Ozzy album has great production. The Sabbath one does not. The performance on the Ozzy album that gets the most controversy is also the highlight for many, as Brad Gilbert's guitar work on this is just sensational. Meanwhile, the controversy on the Sabbath is Dio's singing of Ozzy tunes, but again, Dio's singing is the highlight. So it's kind of interesting that many of the controversies are, in my opinion, the absolute highlights of the album. Overall, both are very good. I had not listened to Speak of the Devil. I listened to it again a couple times before I made this. I hadn't heard it in a while. And boy, it just flooded back memories. I love that double live album. But if I had to choose one, warts and all, I'm taking Live Evil, one of my all-time favorite albums of all time, and a great representation of the Dio era of Sabbath, which is, of course, one of my favorite eras in heavy metal history. They recently put out, I guess I'm going to have to do math in my head here, I guess the 40th anniversary. They did a remix of it, and it sounds incredibly better. There's still, like I said, a little bit of that muddy guitar, but it sounds so much better. They turn up Dio's vocals, they turn up Vinny Appice's drums. That does help quite a bit. So if you've only heard the original, I do recommend going out and getting the 40th anniversary edition of it. The remix is much better. But speaking of Dio's voice and the gorgeous power that it has, We're also going to talk about the best vocal performance of 1982. So let's get to those nominees next and see if Dio, the two-time defending champion, will be able to defend his crown against a slew of fantastic contenders. The 5 nominees for Best Heavy Metal Vocal Performance in 1982. Our first nominee, we just got through talking about him, Black Sabbath, with the live version of Heaven and Hell. Production issues aside, this album is a tour de force for the vocal prowess of one Ronnie James Dio. I could have picked Children of the Sea. I could have picked Voodoo. I could have picked Sign of the Southern Cross. But this version of Heaven and Hell is so iconic, and it just represents, some people believe, the best song in the Dio Sabbath era. So our first nominee, Black Sabbath, Heaven and Hell. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the great album, The Number of the Beast. And our second nominee, Iron Maiden, with their song, Hallowed Be Thy Name. Iron Maiden wants to show off their new singer. Hallowed Be Thy Name might be Bruce Dickinson's all-time greatest vocal performance. It is legendary. Talking about a man on death row, wrongfully accused. Not only does Bruce Dickinson sing the hell out of this song, he also evokes so much emotion from the slow start to the epic crescendo. One of the all-time, if you're a Bruce Dickinson fan and you've never heard, for whatever reason, Hallowed Be Thy Name, this might be Bruce Dickinson's best vocal performance and might just be Iron Maiden's greatest song in their history. That's how good it is. Second nominee, Iron Maiden, Hallowed Be Thy Name. Well, we couldn't get too far without talking about our third nominee, Judas Priest, with their song, Screaming for Vengeance. Rob Halford and Ronnie James Dio have been kind of going back and forth with this title for a while, as they are, in my opinion, the two greatest heavy metal vocalists of all time. And Rob Halford is going to stake a major claim here. Screaming for Vengeance, not really one of the hit songs like You've Got Another Thing Coming or Electric Eye, but it is so fast and so intense and really is a great vehicle for Rob Halford's high-ranged pitch. Ooh, this album's so good. Our third nominee, Judas Priest, Screaming for Vengeance. Our fourth nominee is a newcomer to the field, and his band is a newcomer as well. Manowar, with their song Battle Hymn. Once again, Eric Adams is a new voice, but man, you can't, technically, you probably can't find a finer voice in singing today. He absolutely lights it up on this entire album. I could have picked several songs. I went with Battle Hymn just simply because it's my favorite song on the album, but you could go with, again, Manowar. I came this close to put in on that one. He is an awesome vocalist. I made the point earlier that when they were recording this first album, the band was really encouraging him to go for it, and he was so worried that he was going to blow out his pipes. He was like, I don't know. The band convinced him to do it, and boy, the results speak for themselves. And here we are, again. I love this, almost 50 years later, and his voice is still going strong to this day. Amazing stuff. Our fourth nominee, Manowar, with Battle Hymn. And finally, our fifth and final nominee, the Scorpions, with the song China White. Klaus Meine is one of my favorite vocalists, one of the best vocalists in the history of heavy metal, and yet he has been like the runner-up so many years to Halford and Dio. Is this finally the year that Klaus breaks through with this tremendously haunting song off their Blackout album? And the winner is, for the first time in several years, The winner of this is not going to be named Rob Halford or Ryan James Dio. The defending champion has been beaten. Iron Maiden with Hallowed Be Thy Name. All 5 of these songs are fantastic. All 5 of these songs are sung beautifully. But tie goes to the best song, and the best song of this bunch is Hallowed Be Thy Name. Bruce Dickinson. We talked about this last week on the Iron Maiden special, but as much as I love Paul Di'Anno, Bruce Dickinson's voice is perfect for Iron Maiden. And this first album, he just lets it loose. Congratulations to Bruce Dickinson. Now, on the female side of things, we're going to go with, you talk about Dio and Halford dominating the male side. Pat Benatar with her song, Shadows of the Night. I think this is the 3rd year in a row we've given best female metal performance to Pat Benatar, and it's deserved. She is an absolute tour de force at this point in her career and is doing the best female vocalist by far during this stretch. So congratulations to Bruce Dickinson and Pat Benatar, 2 very worthy award winners. Now you're probably asking yourself, okay, what did the Grammys do? You know, the Grammys, the monitors of excellence in music. Well, they have a couple of different categories. Number 1, let's give the Grammys credit where credit's due. They also have figured out Pat Benatar is by far the best female vocalist. So she did win the Grammy that year for Shadows of the Night. But the best male vocalist, John Cougar Mellencamp with Hurt So Good. You know, back in the day, I was once on a field trip when someone said, the only thing worse than a John Cougar Mellencamp song is another John Cougar Mellencamp song, and they proceeded to rip the cassette right out of the stereo. I can't stand John Cougar Mellencamp. When I think about pretentious, I think, the man with, John Mellencamp, John Mellencamp, he couldn't even, decide on what his real name was. I just thought he was just a little pipsqueak from the Midwest that just thought he was better than he was. If you want to, not that he's a great vocalist, but, if I'm going to go to a great Midwestern singer from that era, I'm going Tom Petty all the way. I just don't think if you want to say John Cougar Mellencamp is a great songwriter, I'll give you that one. But as a singer, I never thought he was anything special. He definitely doesn't belong in the same category as a Dio or a Halford, etc. And finally, I found this one kind of interesting. The best vocal for a group was Survivor and Eye of the Tiger. Oh boy, what an era we lived in when Eye of the Tiger, if you remember, I don't know how many of you have watched the old Rocky movies, but Rocky 3 was the big, Rocky 1 was like this underground independent film. Rocky 2 was starting to catch on. Rocky 3 was full-fledged Hollywood, Mr. T's coming in there, all that. And there's Survivor blaring Eye of the Tiger. It was a huge hit. Survivor was, I think, a one-hit wonder. I can't think off the top of my head anything else they ever did. And it was fine. Everybody was into it at the time, but I didn't think the vocals of that were all that intriguing. Again, not in the same category as an Eric Adams or a Klaus Meine. I just don't see, it seems like the Grammys, and maybe I'm wrong. If you think that John Cougar Mellencamp has an amazing voice or the guys from Survivor are wonderful, let me know in the comments below. But it just doesn't seem like they're really looking at best vocal performances. Just, oh, there's a group that had a big hit. Let's make that best vocals. So down with John Cougar Mellencamp, Melon Patch Kid, whatever he was going by back then. Down with Survivor. Out they go. We're sticking with best vocal performance across all the rock categories, Bruce Dickinson and Pat Benatar, because they deserve it. And that's our show. This is the time where I pitch, this is still a pretty young channel, so go out, subscribe to the channel, like this video, put comments down below. It helps the YouTube algorithm. You probably hear that on all of these videos, but it's true. The YouTube algorithm is a mystery to us all. We're just, trying to get our content out for people who like Iron Maiden, who like Black Sabbath. We want them to find this information and have them join in on all the fun. And you don't want to miss all this content. Right now, we are going through the year 1982. We've talked about Best Newcomer being Man of War. We've now talked about Best Instrumental Performances from Iron Maiden, Best Vocal Performances from Iron Maiden. We still have Song of the Year and Album of the Year to go. So you don't want to miss any of this future content. So if you subscribe to the channel, you'll be alerted to all our content. We try to do this every Tuesday, 7 p.m. Denver Mountain Time. So we hope to see you there. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.